The Russian community in particular have been quite adamant that I do a series on a T-34. Well, where better to visit a T-34 than to come to Russia? We're in a little town called Prohlídka, a tad west of Moscow, to have a look at their T-34-85. It's the middle of June, it's absolutely freezing, but my Russian camera crew says it's actually kind of warm, so we're going to do this anyway. The T-34 was doing quite well, but it needed a little bit of an upgrade to the gun. The 76mm was starting to show its age, so by August of '43, they started investigating as to whether or not you could put an 85mm into it. Well, the answer was yes, you could, but you needed to increase the turret ring diameter to about 1600mm, quite an increase over the 1420 of the earlier T-34. This did allow one significant advantage though, and that was you can now put a wider turret with a 3-man crew. This fixed a significant failing of the older T-34, which was a little bit cramped and the 2-man crew were overworked and inefficient. We're going to look at the T-34 in the usual manner you are now familiar with. We're going to start at the front and work our way around, look at the engine, and then hop inside. Maybe even take it for a spin. We'll see. The vehicle's front hull, 45mm of armor sloped at 60 degrees, top and bottom. This is a sort of a mid-production vehicle. It has a small, narrow rail at the front. Early ones had a larger radius, and later ones they dispensed with it entirely and just went with a 2-piece direct weld. If you look at the details, on the far left and right wings are 2 armored plugs. This is for the track tension system. Now there's some misconception that because T-34 had slack unsupported track, you didn't need to tension it. Well, this is absolutely wrong. If you don't keep even unsupported track at a correct level of tension, you will walk the track off. So in order to tension a track, what you do is you firstly release a lock which is on the inside of the tank, right in the front corners in the bow. You then take a tool, insert down into here, and you crank a worm drive, which will then move the idler wheel forwards or backwards. When you're done, inside the tank you lock the idler back into position, put your plug back on the top, and away you go. Other features on the front: 2 tow hooks, spare track, and of course machine gun, a horn and headlight are on the left. If you want to know a little bit more about the specifications of the tank, well, I got Yuri Pashlock off the screen here teaching me the finer points of T-34ology, and one of the things it points out is the serial number is actually coded. The first character, in this case of 4, is the year of manufacture, 1944. The next 2 characters are the month, 12, December. Lastly, 117 means that it was the 117th tank to come off the line that month in Nizhny Tagil. Now, it doesn't say Nizhny Tagil on this, but there are a couple of features around the tank which indicate that was the plant of manufacture. Every single manufacturing plant had its own little idiosyncrasies which it implemented into the tank. So a T-34 built in one plant was not necessarily identical with a T-34 built in another plant. They would just fit to the same general design and specifications. External fuel tanks, 90 litres. You have one, of course, on each side. Now, later on in production, you were able to put 4 of them. These were not part of the fuel system. They were simply extra fuel that you could then pump yourself into the fuel tanks. Moving a bit further forward, this is an access cover for some of the oil. There's one on the far side as well. Now, common to everything else on this tank, it is bolted down. You can't do any maintenance at all without tools. So undo these bolts, lift this up out of the way, undo more bolts, you can finally access your lubricants. Moving forward, this is a post-war edition, so ignore it. You keep going. Of course, you got the handrails for the tank riders, firing port for personal weapons, the horn, headlight, and finally, point to note is the welding. Now, if you compare the weld with that on earlier T-34s, especially the early war production ones, you'll see this is far, far better. About partway through the war, a Soviet engineer figured out the concept of submerged arc welding, which is far more efficient, far faster, less man-hours. The welds that it produced were so strong, in testing was actually stronger than the armor that it was welding together. So, improvement there. Finally, on the side, an access point here for one of the suspension units. There's another one you can see right here after the turret, but also you can see that the turret is on top of it, so in order to do any maintenance, you got to pull the turret off, which is mildly inconvenient. Finally, fuel filler point, and as ever, you got to open up the bolts in order to gas up the tank. Now, T-34 is not the most refined tank in the world. A perfect example of this is found in the running gear. Now, most of the tanks you're going to look at, they will have some form of mechanism to stop the track from falling apart. There's maybe a clip, maybe a bolt. If you got double pin track like an American system, for example, you got end connectors. This, as you can see, there's absolutely nothing which stops the track pin from working its way out of the track. The only thing that keeps the track together in the end, however, is this ramp, which if the track pin has worked its way out too far, when it comes forward and hits this ramp, it just gets whacked back into place. A somewhat crude technique. However, given how long they expected the tank was going to survive in battle anyway, it really didn't matter. This wasn't supposed to last for years and years. It was supposed to last 1 or 2 battles, maybe 3 battles, and chances are by then your tank was dead or the track was dead. Didn't matter. The links themselves, 72 per side, cast a Hadfield steel. There are 2 types of link on each track, 36 of each. One will have the center guide, and the other will have a hole. This hole is used for ice grousers. Basically, once every 6 or so link, you're going to put an ice grouser in here. It gives you a little bit more traction on particularly loose or slippy surfaces. To propel the tank forward, again, this is a bit like the BT we saw before. Most tanks are going to have a sprocket wheel. Not so in the case of T-34 and its derivatives. There are rollers in the drive wheel, each of which will mesh with the center guide, and this will propel the tank forward. Now, the advantage of this is that there is no friction. You're talking about rollers meshing with the teeth. The downside, though, of course, you're talking about all the attractive effort going through a single piece of metal every other link. And when you start talking about 40-ton tanks, you start getting to a weak point. So at that point, it was about as far as you went, and later tanks you would see a more traditional sprocket wheel. Moving back right quick to the main road wheels, 830 millimeters each one. There are 5 pairs per side on the Christie suspension. These particular road wheels are unique to the Nizhny Tagil factory. Other road wheels for T-34s, you see some were solid, some were spoked. But by a combination of various different features, you can tell where a tank was built. And this was one of the features that Yuri was telling me, aha, Nizhny Tagil tank. So I come around to the back of the tank, we have more armor plate at 45 millimeters thick, also well sloped. And it's starting to come across some of the inefficiency. If the back of the tank is as well armored as the front of the tank almost, you wonder if that's really the most effective use of the weight. However, that said, if you were to be shot at from the rear, better to have it than not. Dominated by a large access port. Undo these bolts, you can open this up and you can access the starter motor, the transmission and the steering clutches. Exhaust ports on each side, and the entire plate can be unbolted. As you can see, it's hinged and you can bring it forward. The 67.5 litre tanks I mentioned earlier, it was more often than not 3 of the 4 external tanks would be filled with fuel, and the 4th one would have oil in it. Outside of that, underneath, you have the tow hooks, as you would expect. These little pipes up here are for smoke dischargers, and you can barely see at the top here a convoy light, small little red bulb. So this particular tank does have a third 90-litre tank on the right-hand side. Now, the internal fuel capacity was about 680 litres. If you add that to the external tanks, it would be expected that, again, diesel engine, this tank will go about 300 kilometres, which is actually pretty reasonable. Under the turret, we have another access port for a suspension unit. And I'm told another unique Nizhny Tagil feature is its sort of flat triangle on the side of the turret, which apparently most other T-34-85s did not have. So after spinning the turret, we can open up the back hatch. Of course, it requires the use of a tool, like everything else on this tank does. However, it's actually pretty simple. It's just a case of lever it up and pull it back. This reveals to us the V234 is a V12 diesel, cranks at about 500 horsepower. The cooling system is about the only thing you can actually access under here. The filler cap is right in the center. There are radiators on each side of the engine, under the louvers here. The capacity of the cooling system is 75 litres. Not much else to be seen from the top here. We're going to close this up and then open up the transmission compartment. Transmission compartment is held in place. There are some relatively quick release springs here, which have already been conveniently halfway opened up. Aha. And now a nice light. Oh, come on. Oh. It helps if you're not standing on it. There we go, much better. Underneath, you can see these cooling louvers. They are on a swivel shutter, so you can actually close these up if you need more protection from airburst or aircraft attack. Underneath, you can see the large flywheel, which of course transmits the power back to the transmission. If you look down the very far bottom, you can see the control linkages for the clutches and brakes. There's one on each side, obviously for steering. You can also see the two multi-cyclone air filters. Unfortunately, if you've got to change these air filters out, and you have to do it usually every 25 hours, you have to pull out these armoured louvers first. That will then allow you to access the air filters. It's not the end of the world because there's only a couple of bolts on each side, but it's still a nuisance that you don't really want to deal with all that much. The maintenance on this is a little bit intensive. After only 10 hours of use, you're supposed to check the clutch plate, make sure it goes 6 to 7 millimeters. If you're lucky enough to get your engine going 25 hours, you gotta clean out your air filters. If your tank lasts for 50 hours of travel or 1,000 kilometers, then things really start getting nasty. You have to start disassembling the suspension to get at them. However, if you're lucky, your tank won't last that long. You won't have to do the maintenance, just go get another tank. There's a lot of ways of almost falling off this tank, by the way. It's not quite as bad as Matilda, but it's pretty nasty. And thus ends part 1. So part 2, of course, turret and inside.